Hi everyone, this is lecture 13 for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to delve into more detail in talking about global trade and finance. These are topics that we started to talk about when we were discussing international political economy, and today we're going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of global trade and finance and how some of these international organizations that we mentioned, we talked about their formation, how they actually coordinate the incredible volume of economic activity that happens at the global level. So what we'll cover today, we're going to ask, how do international organizations shape and direct global trade and finance today? We're also going to look at why international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, are so controversial. They're incredibly controversial. Their meetings are frequently protested by large swaths of protesters. The countries in which they operate, sometimes the very involvement of an organization like the IMF can lead to collapse of governments, leaders being voted out of office. That is the degree of controversy which accompanies these types of organizations. So we'll talk about why that is, because it might not be immediately clear. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the dangers associated with an increasingly globalized economy. We tend to talk about economic globalization as if it's this wonderful thing, and in many ways it is. Our lives would seem very different if it were not part of our existence. But there's a range of dangers that kind of emerge once you have this increasingly globalized, increasingly interdependent economy. So, global trade and finance today. This is probably not news to any of you. I'm sure you're aware of this, particularly if you are interested in international relations and you regularly read, the world section of your newspaper. But global trade and finance are at a remarkable kind of high watermark. The volume of trade in both goods and services, and also just financial transactions, money transfers, accounts, investments. Right now, it surpasses any previous period in human history. It's just kind of exponentially grown. And this has really been the case over the past 30 or 40 years as some of these new technologies come online, as businesses, corporations, and financial institutions expand their footprint. So they're now operating across many different countries. We're seeing a period in which there's just never been this degree of economic interaction happening across international borders. So we have seen an explosion of cross-border economic interaction in the past few decades. And while this is happening, the major international organizations, some of which we talked about last time, the Bretton Woods organizations, the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, and existing institutions like various components of the United Nations or regional organizations like the European Union, the Organization of American States, they've had to craft laws and practices around this activity. Because we're in uncharted territory, a lot of the types of things that happen in the global economy we didn't need regulations for before because they were so kind of infrequent. We could deal with it on an ad hoc basis. But as this volume of interaction has increased, you have lots of actors saying we need to figure out a way to regulate this, figure out a way to kind of bring some order to all of this activity that's occurring, bring some stability to all this activity that's occurring. And these organizations are acting as champions. They're acting as cheerleaders. All of the organizations that we're talking about have specific worldviews about the global economy, about trade, about finance, about development. And so they're acting really as advocates at the same time that they're crafting the rules for global trade and finance. So all that's happening. Let's try to get a sense of this. I'm going to show you some charts that kind of delve into these increases in economic interaction, both in terms of trade and in terms of finance. This is probably the longest time horizon presentation of economic globalization that you're ever going to see. It was compiled from a number of different resources looking at economic globalization starting in the 16th century, starting in 1500 up until 2011 when this graph was put together to see the increase in exports and imports as a share of global gross domestic product or GDP, right? So the total value of goods and services being produced in the world, what is the share of this that is comprised of exports and imports? Exports and imports meaning these are goods being shipped out of a country or being imported into a country. So this gives you a sense of how much of the world's economic activity is happening cross-border in nature, right? You can see, and don't even get me started on how they put this together. I mean, this is probably somebody's, lifelong work trying to do this. I don't envy the person that tried to trace economic globalization for, 500 years. But you can see at the outset that it's basically the first 300 years is an estimate, right? So you see two lines there. There's the conservative estimate and then the more liberal estimate. Somewhere between maybe a little over zero, not quite 1%, and 9% at the upper bound for the first 300 years we're looking at, 330 years we're looking at. Less than 10%, and for much of that, significantly less than 5% or 6% of activity was happening global in scope. Right? It starts to increase. It begins to kind of go on the uptick, but a very, very small percentage of the world's economic activity was cross-border in nature. Okay, we have some missing data. There's a time period in which there's just no data that we can pull together to figure out what was happening in terms of the global economy. And then it picks up again right before the beginning of the 20th century. Again, we have two lines. There's an estimate somewhere, the reality is probably somewhere between that upper limit and that lower limit. And we see kind of a gradual uptick right until probably, 1914. There was a tremendous expansion and growth right before the beginning of World War I, and then we see drastic declines, a slight uptick, and then drastic declines. So there was a volatile period. You had two world wars. There were increases in the share of the global economy that was happening cross-border, but then there was this sharp downtick. And then really since the beginning of that orange line is probably right at the end of World War II, we start to see this uptick to the point where by 2011, right, where this data ends, almost 60% of the world GDP is a product of exports and imports. So 60% of the world's wealth production is occurring cross-border in nature. It involves exports and imports. There's also this interesting little downtick right before the end of the graph, which would be the financial crisis, right? That looks like it's right about 2008, 2009. That was a period of tremendous instability in the global economy, and there was a decline in global trade as a result, but it recovered pretty quickly, right? But the key thing to note is that in a very, very short time period, right, we have drastically increased the amount of economic interaction that's happening across national borders, right? That's just a fact. So in terms of trade, right, there's significantly more global activity than there has been at really any era in human history. Our economy, it's not an exaggeration. We're not being hyperbolic when we say we have a truly global economy. Okay. This gets into the finance side, right? So when we talk about trade, we're generally talking about goods and services flowing across national borders, right? So these are, iPods, lawnmowers, clothing, those sorts of tangible products. It can also be things like education. It can be financial services. Those that captures the services side. But when we get into finance, we're talking about the movement of money, generally, the movement of capital, right? So this includes things like banking. It includes things like foreign investment, right? And this is a much shorter graph. This only goes back to 1980. And again, it's the percentage of world GDP. So it's how much of the world's wealth production is occurring as a result of these activities. And we see a significant uptick. We see growth in pretty much every one of these categories. So we have bank and money market flows, portfolio equity, foreign direct investment. All of these things are growing, and as an aggregate share, they're growing as well, right? So more money is moving around the world, right? And this is only in the last, this one only goes up to 2005, so we're talking about really in a 15-20 year period. There's a pretty rapid increase in the amount of money that's moving around the world. So on the finance side, there's pretty significant globalization happening as well. One thing that we just touched upon last time, we just kind of mentioned it. I didn't go into it in a great degree of detail. I talked about it in the context of the International Monetary Fund, the dollar standard, and the eventual collapse of the dollar standard. But currency speculation is a huge part of the global economy, and just in general, something called foreign exchange, right? Foreign exchange refers to anytime you're trading a currency for another currency, right? So it is something as simple as you go on vacation and you're in a country that doesn't use US dollars, and you go into the currency exchange office and you get your pesos or your euros or your yen or your ruble, whatever it might be, right? That's foreign exchange, right? So that's part of foreign exchange. There are also investors that strategically exchange currency in an effort to make profit off of the exchange of money. How do they do that? Well, you've probably seen how there is fluctuation in exchange rates, right? You go on vacation and you walk into the exchange office and they're offering one rate, on Monday when you go in, and then you run out of money, you run out of the local currency, and you go in on Friday to exchange some more of your dollars for whatever the currency is, and the exchange rate maybe has changed very slightly, right? Usually, there are individuals who invest huge amounts of money into currency speculation in an effort to gain money off of those tiny little minute fluctuations in the value of a currency, right? So in order to generate some sort of profit in this type of activity, you have to just have a massive amount of money at your disposal, right? So a penny or two on the exchange rate isn't going to matter much if you're exchanging $100 or $50, right? But if you have $2 billion and you exchange your currency and take advantage of that fluctuation in your favor, if you kind of estimate correctly that there's going to be a negative or a positive fluctuation in the value of a specific currency, then you can make millions of dollars doing virtually nothing, right? Just having access to the capital to take advantage of that fluctuation. So currency speculation is something that happens, and because of the volume of money that needs to be utilized to actually take advantage of those tiny little fluctuations, it's a huge amount of money. So foreign exchange markets daily, there's 5.3 trillion with a T dollars that are traded on foreign exchange markets. And that's an estimate because there's so much money being traded so quickly that we really can never know, right? We can't know specifically what the amount is, but that's the best estimate of how much is occurring. A lot of that is just foreign exchange, right? It's just people exchanging their money when they're in a different country, or it's countries, national banks wanting to have access to other forms of currency, and so they go in and they participate in foreign exchange. But a pretty significant percentage of it is this practice of currency speculation. So currency trading is a thing. This gives you a sense of some of the top currency traders. These are banks, right? Currency trading can be a little bit dangerous. It's hard to know how a currency is going to fluctuate. You have to make all sorts of estimates and predictions based on a country's monetary policy and how a currency is performing relative to other currencies. But this gives you a sense of the big ones. The biggest by far is Citibank. They have about 16% of the market share in currency trading. But these are the biggest banks in the world: Deutsche Bank, Barclays, JP Morgan, United Bank of Switzerland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a money-generating activity for these banks, and they trade lots and lots of money. And it makes sense that, this is banks as opposed to private individuals, because, as I said, to engage in currency trading, you have to have lots and lots of money on hand to be able to perform this sort of exchange. And who has lots of money on hand? Banks do, right? They have all your money. So this is an activity that happens. In terms of the currencies that are traded, this gives you a sense of the most valued currencies in the world, right? If a significant daily share of what's being traded on the foreign exchange market is your currency, that means that people want your currency. Your currency is in high demand. And by far, the currency that is in the highest demand is the US dollar. It constitutes about 87% of the foreign exchange markets. You have the other major currencies there: euro, yen, the pound sterling, the Australian dollar, the franc, the Canadian dollar, etc. These are all currencies that are viewed by investors and individuals and banks to be relatively stable. We trust these currencies. Currencies that you're not seeing on here are they're less desirable. They're viewed as less stable, and they're in less high demand. But by far, the most valued currency globally is the US dollar. If you've ever traveled abroad and you've gone to a country that doesn't have the most stable economy, right? People want your dollars. You might have experienced this, right? If you're traveling someplace and it's kind of a developing economy and the local currency maybe isn't, really super trustworthy, the advice that you often get when you're traveling is like, be really careful with your US dollars. There's people who will try to scam you, and they say, oh, you have to convert all of your dollars to the local currency, and then you're going to have a very hard time getting your dollars back now that you have this local currency, right? So that is because the US dollar is in demand. That is because we trust the United States government to make sound decisions when it comes to monetary policy. We trust the United States government not to just start printing money just because we can. So that's why this number is as high as it is. It also gives United States citizens and corporations a tremendous advantage in terms of participating in the global economy, because we know that our currency, the currency that we get in our national economy, is going to be valued pretty much anywhere we go. Okay, so that's just a kind of a picture of what's happening with regard to trade and what's happening with regard to finance. And the key thing to note is it's a massive, massive volume of economic transactions happening on a daily basis, and it's happening in many cases almost instantaneously, right? Things like currency trading, you have to take advantage of very, very small fluctuations in these exchange rates, and you have to move huge amounts of money around the world very, very quickly, right? And we can do that via things like wire transfer, that it was difficult to do 30 or 40 years ago. It was difficult to kind of have the technology to enable these forms of instantaneous exchange. Okay, but now we can do that, and we can do it with greater ease than we've done in the past. So how do international organizations help to structure and facilitate this interaction that's occurring, this explosive volume of interaction that is unlike any period in human history that we've ever seen before. I'm going to talk about two big ones that we've mentioned before in the previous lecture. I'll talk about the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. We'll talk about them as both regulators and facilitators of global trade and global economic activity. Turning first to the World Bank, we'll talk about some of its key functions. The World Bank, as we said, formed from the GATT, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was not an international organization. It was just an agreement. It was just a piece of international law, an agreement that countries signed on to. In 1995, it has 162 member states, which is a majority of the countries in the world, but not all. There are countries that are actively petitioning to be part of the WTO. There are countries that have absolutely no interest in being part of the WTO. But that's the membership. And each country gets one vote. The voting structure is a little bit misleading. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But each country gets one vote. It's a one country, one vote sort of thing. So you have a national representative that would represent your country in the WTO, and then usually some sort of negotiation team and lawyers, right? But that's the kind of core attributes of the organization itself. So what does it do? It provides settings in which countries can negotiate trade agreements. And the goal, largely, is to eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade, which we talked about tariffs and non-tariff barriers last time. But that is the primary function of the World Trade Organization, is how do we enable goods and services to flow more freely around the world. And so they have these trade rounds, right? They have these periods in which there's an agenda set, and countries' representatives come together and they negotiate what are going to be the terms and the rules by which we'll eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade. These take a very long time. They have begun taking more and more and more time. When the WTO initially started out, it was not uncommon to have a trade round that would be wrapped up in a matter of months or a year. And now we're having trade rounds that go on for several years, take a really, really long time, and have a more complex agenda and a more kind of contentious exchange between the countries involved, which makes sense. The WTO has grown in size. When it was initially formed as the GATT, you only had about 20 countries involved, and its mandate has grown. As we said last time, a lot of the tariffs have been drawn down to the point where tariffs now, it's kind of a negligible cost in international trade. But there have been other issues that have emerged. Labor practices, environmental standards, all sorts of more complex regulations related to health and safety, which might have an impact on trade and the ability of goods to flow back and forth, but it's not as simple as pinpointing a tariff and saying, okay, Germany places this tariff on United States goods, and so what are the terms under which you're going to get rid of that tariff, right? So the agenda has become more complex, and there's more countries involved, and so that might help explain why the trade rounds are taking longer. When you become a member of the WTO, you sign on to certain expectations, certain responsibilities. WTO members agree to grant each other what's called Most Favored Nation status, or MFN status. Most Favored Nation status basically means that you're going to treat every country that is a member of the WTO. If you're a member of the WTO, you're going to treat them all the same, right? So the United States is not going to say, okay, Canada, you're our neighbor to the north, and we share this long border, and we have this important common history, and so we're going to give you a preferential status relative to Australia, because Australia is, way down in the sticks, and we don't have this special history with them, right? You can't do that in the WTO, and if a country alleges that you do that, then you can get in trouble for that. And the WTO is actually the organization that polices that. They have something in the WTO. This is one of the things that makes the WTO unique relative to the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. They have something called the Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which is a standing body It's a setting in which trade disputes between member nations can be heard and resolutions can be reached. Not necessarily resolutions in terms of like, oh, it provides this setting in which we sit down and hash out our differences and come to some sort of amicable agreement. No, it's a standing body that kind of arbitrates the disputes. It acts as a third party between states and then issues a decision. And as a WTO member, you're bound by that decision, right? It's heard about 400 or so cases since its formation, so since 1995. So that's pretty frequent use for an international organization. There have been several trade disputes that have been brought to the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, and it's pretty effective in terms of its enforcement because countries that are part of the WTO want to stay in the good graces of the WTO. It generally benefits them to be members of the WTO, and so they'll abide by these decisions or face potential economic repercussions for not doing so. Okay, so that's another really important function of the WTO. And if a country was to allege that another country was giving preferential treatment to a third party country and not abiding by this most favored nation status stipulation, then they could get into trouble and it could be brought to this dispute settlement mechanism. So that's a little bit about the WTO. The IMF is another very important international organization that helps deal with some of these issues. It has a larger membership than the WTO. It's 188 countries. It was founded in 1944, and as we said, its original mission was currency-based, right? We said there was going to be this international medium of exchange, which was the US dollar, and it was the IMF's role to oversee that exchange rate system and ensure the stability of that currency. It changed. That changed in 1973. I mentioned this in the last lecture when President Nixon said this whole, kind of, you can exchange US dollars for gold if you want, if you feel that the currency isn't going to hold its value. He realized there wasn't enough gold to do that and abandoned that exchange rate system. And so we moved to a floating exchange rate system. And IMF lost a core part of its mission, right? And its mission evolved. And we mentioned that last time, but I'll talk a little bit more about it now. The thing I'll mention first is that votes in the IMF are apportioned a little bit differently. Basically, every country has a quota that they have to provide to the IMF. They have a payment, an annual payment that they have to provide to the IMF, which is based on their share of the global economy, right? So if you have a very large, very successful economy, you have a larger quota. You have to pay more to the IMF into this pool of resources that they create. But you get more of a vote share, right? So your vote is really dependent on the size of your economy, how much of global economic output your country is responsible for. So it means that very wealthy countries get very large vote shares. All right, I'll show you the specific numbers on that in a second, but just keep that in the back of your head. So what does the IMF do? Well, it doesn't have that currency-based mission anymore. It has become what's called a lender of last resort. Basically, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, today provides short-term infusions of money to countries that are experiencing what's called currency crisis. It has to be paid back. It's a loan, it's not a gift, and it has to be paid back with interest, usually on a pretty rapid timetable. There's no set, you pay it back within a year, you pay it back within 6 months. That's all negotiated at the point at which a country invites the IMF in and says, we need your help, right? They would meet with IMF negotiators and try and figure out what the timetable would be. But this is not a mortgage, right? You don't pay it back over 30 years. It's usually, 6 months, a year, 2 years. They're huge, huge loans, billions of dollars, and they have interest and you have to pay them back quickly. So what is currency crisis? Currency crisis is when there's serious doubt as to whether a country's central bank has sufficient foreign exchange reserves to maintain the country's fixed exchange rate, right? So if a country has an exchange rate and is linking their currency to the value of other currencies, and there is doubt within the country that the central bank, the bank that is associated with the government, like our Federal Reserve, right? That's our central bank. If there is doubt that the central bank has sufficient reserves to provide, whatever the exchange currency would be, U.S. dollars or euros or whatever it would be, um, to provide that to people when people need access to foreign exchange reserves, right? Um, then then you're in a currency crisis. That might seem kind of mundane. It might seem like that. Why is that such a big deal? That if you were in Spain and wanted U.S. dollars and couldn't get them, why would that be a problem? Because it limits your ability to participate in global trade, right? You saw that chart at the outset saying 60% of all economic activity is happening in cross-border exchanges. Well, that means that if your country is in a currency crisis, you are shut off from 60% of the world's economic activity, right? Only thing that you have access to is what's available locally. You don't have access to the entirety of global trade. It's a terrible condition to be in. What's worse is that when that happens, foreign investors, people who are investing in your economy, uh, become really freaked out. They're really scared that your central bank, through mismanagement, has gotten itself into this position where there's not sufficient foreign exchange reserves, and they start to pull out. So your economy starts to lose all of this important foreign money that it's getting, and it becomes this kind of downward spiral, right? Obviously, if foreign investors are pulling out, that means you're going to have even less of a foreign exchange reserves coming into your country, so the problem becomes worse, and eventually, this can lead to complete breakdown within societies. This can lead to societies falling apart, people not being able to get access to their savings, banks collapsing, lots of people losing their jobs. Your economy can just go into a tailspin. So it's a really bad situation that you want to avoid at all costs. If that were happening to you, if you were on the verge of a currency crisis, you would call up the IMF. You would say, look, we're in a serious situation. You need to come to our country. You need to assess what's happening. And we're probably going to need some sort of infusion of money to get us past this period of instability. So the IMF would come in and hopefully they would provide you with a loan. But the loans come with strings attached. And those strings are called conditionality. Basically, the loans, these short-term interest-based, rapidly paid back loans by the IMF, not only do you have to pay them back, you have to pay them back quickly, and you have to pay them back with interest, but you have to agree to make changes in your domestic policy that are dictated by the IMF. So the IMF comes in and they say, look, you got yourself into this position through mismanagement. Why don't you have sufficient foreign exchange reserves? Here are the things that you need to do in order to ensure that you have plenty of currency on hand and you don't encounter another one of these currency crises. Usually what that entails is rapid spending reductions. Usually the IMF will come in and say your government is spending too much money. The government is a consumer of too many things, and it's providing too many things for its citizens, and that's why you're running into these currency issues. So that will mean changes in domestic policy. That's called austerity. Usually means cutting back on basic services, pensions, things like that. We'll talk about all that a bit more in just a second. Okay, so that's what the IMF does. It's a lender. It's a lender of last resort. If you're going to the IMF for a loan, you're in trouble, right? And it's an advisor, right? It comes in and provides advice, but it's not advice that, like, boy, it would be great if you did this. It's basically like, if you want access to this money, which is probably the only thing that's preventing your society from collapsing, you need to do these things. So it's advice that you pretty much have to follow. Okay. So those are the functions of the IMF. I want to talk a little bit about voting power. So I said that the voting power in the IMF is based on a country's quota, right? So the quota is how much you contribute, and it's based on your share of the global economy. The quota is where the IMF gets the money to do the lending, right? So you might have been asking yourself, like, how does the IMF just have billions of dollars on hand to loan to countries in trouble? Well, every member of the IMF, when you become a member of the IMF, you agree to pay this quota, and you have to pay it, right? And that creates a pool of resources that the IMF can then draw upon to lend to countries that are in trouble. Okay. This shows you roughly what the percentage breakdown is for quota, right? And it lines up pretty closely with voting power, and that's by design, right? So, for instance, the US is about 17% of the global economy, the global economic output. So, it has a 17% quota. That's the portion of the IMF's annual budget that they contribute, and they get 17% of the voting power, right? Whereas Brazil, for example, is a much smaller economy. It's only about 1.4% of the global economy, and they get 1.4% of the voting power. Meaning that the United States voice in the IMF, the internal decision making of the IMF when they vote on whatever matter it might be, the United States gets roughly 17 times the voting power that a country like Brazil gets. Okay. That's a very different voting structure than the World Trade Organization. The argument for that, right, is that these are investments. The United States has a larger investment; they get more of a say. It's basically a shareholder model, right? If you were at a shareholders meeting for a company and you had, 30,000 shares, and another person had 10 shares in a company, it would seem to make sense that the person with 30,000 shares should get more of a say than the person with 10 shares. Okay. So that's how voting works in the IMF when they have to make a decision. There's a lot of discretion at the IMF. So, like individual decisions about whether or not to lend to a country, a lot of that is decisions that are made kind of at the technocrat level. They have these individuals that have lots of technical expertise, and they come in, and those would be who you're negotiating with, and they have a lot of leeway to make kind of individual level decisions. But the decisions of the organization as a whole, and what its goals and what its objectives should be, those things would be subject to a vote in which country representatives would be voting. Okay, so that's how voting power works. These organizations are super controversial. You've probably heard about them in the news. You've probably, if you've been following what's happening in the European economy, you might have heard about the IMF really recently. I'm going to play you a quick clip that is relates to a recent protest against the IMF that happened in Greece as a result of these austerity measures, just to give you a sense of how worked up people get about the IMF.
As the clock ticks on efforts to save Greece from bankruptcy, people in Athens have taken to the streets to protest against possible new austerity measures. The general strike coincided with the return of EU and IMF officials to the city. Without their approval, Greece will not get another bailout. But Greek workers have seen their income slashed in 5 years of cutbacks, and they're not in a welcoming mood. They're going to impose even more harsh measures, this man says. More sacrifices will not save us from bankruptcy, this Communist Party leader says. The system must be overthrown. In one isolated incident, some turned their anger on a plainclothes policeman, but the protest was otherwise peaceful. Greece needs a €130 billion rescue package. But its leaders are also trying to agree a deal with banks on slashing €100 billion off a €350 billion debt. However, negotiations hit the rocks on Friday and were not due to restart until Wednesday. The industrial action brought Athens to a standstill, but it was unlikely to have the desired effect. Similar protests last year did not deflect the previous government from its path of austerity, and the current administration of technocrats is even more determined to push through the reforms the country's creditors are insisting on.
Okay, so a couple things to note about that clip. The first is the scale of the loans, right? So Greece was asking for a $125 billion bailout. It's exactly what I was just referring to. An infusion of cash, short term, has to be paid back, right? Um, and they also made reference to private debt. Countries, it seems strange to think of it in this way, but countries have private debt, right? Countries will turn to banks and private lenders for loans when they need money. If they're going to the IMF, it means that they've exhausted their line of credit, so to speak, with these private banks. So Greece is in the unenviable situation of being hundreds of billions of dollars in debt to private lenders, and also um, already having received a pretty significant bailout from the IMF. So they already have kind of tapped into that resource once. They're seeking an additional bailout. And more recently, this clip is a little bit old, but so once you receive a bailout from the IMF, they put you on a timetable, right? This is the timetable in which you're going to pay it back. And Greece had a pretty significant lump payment that was coming up, and they said, we're not going to be able to pay this. We don't have the reserves on hand to pay this debt that we've incurred. So they actually defaulted on their debt, which is a really serious step because that potentially means that this lender of last resort is not going to lend to you anymore. So now, I mean, you just don't have access to any sort of foreign exchange reserves, right? Um, so you saw that, right? You saw the scale of the very difficult situation that Greece has found itself in, which is actually a problem for the European economy as a whole, because Greece is a part of what's called the Eurozone. They share a currency with many other countries in Europe, the euro. So the implications of the Greece situation can blow back on those other countries that are part of the Eurozone. So it's a really significant issue in Europe. But you also saw the reaction from the common people on the street that they were interviewing against austerity measures. So when Greece took that first bailout, they agreed to a series of austerity measures in which they would reduce spending. And these really hurt the local people, right? It's very, very hard for the local people. These are things like public pensions for people who have retired. Those were slashed in Greece. Or the salaries for public workers were cut in half in some instances. They increased sales tax in a really interesting and confusing way in Greece, where depending on which region you're in Greece, your national tax could be different. It could be, 15%, or it could be 22%. They're trying to extract basically as much revenue as they can and draw down spending in any way that they can within their domestic economy. And so they're asking citizens to pay more in terms of taxes and also decreasing what the government would be paying out for basic social services and pensions. So it's basically the same thing that an individual would do when they get themselves into a period of financial trouble, right? As you try to reduce your spending as much as possible, and you try to find new ways to bring in excess income. But when you're doing that on a country level, and you have people that have grown accustomed to certain things, they react really angrily, and that's what we've seen in Greece, and that's what we've seen in lots of other places. Okay, so why are these organizations so controversial? You begin to get a sense, right? The World Trade Organization is has these trade rounds that go on for a really long time, and their negotiations have been criticized because of the ways in which they're skewed to favor the interests of wealthy economies. This is what critics would argue. I'm not necessarily saying this is the truth or this is what you should believe, but critics of the World Trade Organization say that a wealthy economy is going to go to those negotiations with a lot more power than a lesser developed country. So the United States, when they go to these trade negotiations for the WTO, they come with armies of trade representatives and lawyers, and they just have a lot of resources at their disposal because they have more money to throw at these things. Whereas if you're from a developing country, right, your vote it still counts in the WTO, but you just have less resources at your disposal, and you have fewer experts, and you can't really play the same role in terms of setting the agenda and determining what's going to happen at these meetings. So there's a certain degree of power, even though there's this formal equality, right? It's one country, one vote, and if 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 Uganda votes one way and the United States votes another way, they technically have the same amount of power within the World Trade Organization. But in reality, these are highly sophisticated, highly technical negotiations, and you need to come with lots of human resources at your disposal, and a lot of developing countries don't have them. And so there's a lot of frustration at these negotiations that the agenda is basically already determined, and the world's most wealthy countries significantly shape what happens there. Right? The negotiations also tend to be secretive. There's been a lot of reaction against the fact that when the WTO gets together to meet, or when the representatives to the IMF get together to meet, we don't really know what happens there, right? We don't. The media isn't invited. It's not broadcast publicly like it would be on C-SPAN. So there's been a lot of reaction against that, right? What's happening behind closed doors? How does it affect us? And why can't the public play more of a role in these high-level negotiations as they occur? Certain critics have also accused the organizations of having kind of a tunnel vision. They look at the economy and they don't focus on these important secondary issues like the environment or women's rights or workers' rights or the rights of indigenous peoples. These things fall by the wayside, and what they're really focused on is making more money, increasing the volume of global trade. But there's important issues linked to that don't really get discussed. So that's another point of critique. The conditionality of IMF lending and other forms of lending also is a real lightning rod for criticism, which you saw in the video in Greece, right? The reality of conditionality is that this leads to very sudden and very painful cuts in core aspects of domestic policy, right? Public pensions that individuals have paid into for their entire lives and they expect to receive. Imagine if tomorrow, all of a sudden, the United States found itself in a financial crisis, and its solution to that crisis was to cut the payments, the entitlement payments in Social Security in half. You have seniors that have limited savings and limited income, and they can't work, they're retired, and the money that they're surviving on all of a sudden has been lopped in half. And they're trying to figure out how they're going to survive, how they're not going to go hungry, how they're not going to get kicked out of their house. That's the reality of some of these IMF conditionality requirements, right? Now, the IMF would say, well, this is, a country shouldn't commit to providing entitlement spending if it doesn't have its financial house in order and doesn't have sufficient revenue in order to provide that service. It's tough, but that's just the reality of what needs to happen when countries find themselves in situations of crisis. Otherwise, the crisis is going to get worse. But for the people that are struggling on the street to survive, right, that can be a very hard pill to swallow. But it's not just pensions, it's things like education, it's things like healthcare, social services, basically anything beyond the core functions of the state that's kind of extra. And a lot of times that's kind of the social side, has to be on the chopping block. It has to be potentially something that could be cut when countries find themselves in a situation of crisis. All those things are super controversial. When you start talking about cutting education or cutting healthcare or cutting benefits for children and mothers, that's a really hard thing to do. That's a really hard domestic policy change to make. And a lot of times domestic policymakers don't necessarily have don't have a lot of leeway to decide that they're not going to do it. That leads to the last point, which is critics view these organizations as violating state sovereignty. Remember that state sovereignty, which has come up a lot in the context of this course, was the idea that states have control and autonomy over their domestic policy. They can't have outside entities, either organizations or corporations or other countries, coming in and telling them what to do with regard to things that are purely domestic affairs. And critics would look at this and say, this is exactly what is happening. These countries if they're not going to spiral into total chaos, they have to make these policy changes. Otherwise, they're not going to get that those IMF funds, right? And so in that sense, conditionality is a violation of state sovereignty. So these organizations are controversial for a variety of reasons, right? It's not an argument against the organizations. I'm not saying that these criticisms are there's not another side to these criticisms. I just want you to understand why when you hear the WTO or the IMF or some of these other organizations mentioned, sometimes there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of public reaction against them. Okay. Want to close by talking about the dangers of global economic interdependence. We talk about economic globalization as if it is a universal good sometimes, and there are a lot of dangers associated with economic interdependence. I want to talk about some of them briefly. Basically, I want to talk about two crises that we've experienced recently. We've experienced within the last 20 years. The first is the East Asian currency crisis, and the second is the more recent global financial crisis that hit around 2008, 2009. And in a lot of ways, we're still trying to emerge from that crisis. So the first graph shows you the value of currencies in East Asia from basically about 1996 up until 2007, a little over 10 years, a little over a 10-year period. There's an interesting story there that I'll just tell you briefly. In 1997, there was a crisis, a financial crisis in East Asia that started with currency speculators. Remember, I said currency speculators are these investors that try to make profit based on little tiny fluctuations in the exchange rate of national currencies. Currency speculators started pulling out their investments in the Thai currency, what's called the Thai baht. That's their local currency, because they didn't think it was a good investment. They didn't think it was going to hold its value. They had some concerns about Thai monetary policy, and so a few big investors, big currency speculators, started to pull their holdings out of the Thai baht, and then this herd mentality set in, and lots of other investors did the same thing. And so the Thai currency, because a lot of a currency's value is based on people wanting to hold the currency, thinking that the currency will hold its value and that it's a worthwhile piece of paper that actually corresponds to some value. The value of the Thai currency started to plummet, right? And then it started to have these ripple effects. So you see here the Philippines, you see South Korea, you see Indonesia. Indonesia was hit incredibly, incredibly hard. So the Thai baht falls at its low point right about halfway through 1997 to basically a little less than half of its original value. Right? So imagine if the actual purchasing power associated with the US dollar in the space of 6 months dropped in half. Basically everything was twice as expensive. Right? Indonesia got it even worse. Indonesia's currency fell to a little less than 20% of what it was. So imagine everything in terms of purchasing power, what you can buy with your local currency. Imagine it being 5 times more expensive. Imagine what that would do to your domestic economy. The Philippines, South Korea, eventually this spread to other countries around the world. Russia was impacted by this. Many countries in Latin America were impacted by this because of the degree to which they traded with these countries in East Asia. The Chinese currency held stable. China is a dynamo of an economy, and it takes a lot to slow China down. But the bottom line is that this was a crisis that was set in motion by the actions of speculators, right, currency speculators, and had ripple effects throughout the world, and took countries. You see that Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, they still haven't recovered from this. This has had a lasting impact for 10 years, 10 plus years. So that's a danger, right? This is the types of danger set in motion by interdependence that wouldn't exist if we were all islands unto ourselves and didn't weren't actively involved in the global economy. More recently, and in probably in ways that you lived through and remember, the global financial crisis, which you see some numbers on the global financial crisis. It's kind of stunning. So now that it's the financial crisis is kind of in the rearview mirror, and we're starting to like figure out how did this happen and why did this happen and what can we do to prevent it again. We can talk about the aggregate losses from the financial bailout, and basically, in terms of the actual value of companies that were wiped out in the last financial crisis, I'm talking about $14.5 trillion in value just lost. It's really stunning, right? $13.8 trillion in lost gross domestic product in the United States, a bailout that constituted overall $9.7 trillion when all is said is done. That's pretty stunning, right? Those are pretty stunning numbers. So this was a financial crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And it's certainly the worst period of economic instability that we've experienced since the Great Depression. And in some countries that are struggling to recover from the global financial crisis, their recovery period has actually been longer than the recovery period after the Great Depression. So it's the worst crisis that we've experienced since the Great Depression, and the recovery has been more protracted. Right. This was a crisis that was set in motion by the degree of economic interdependence. Basically, the starting point for the financial crisis, if you remember, right, if you were kind of paying attention to this thing as it unfolded, or you've paid attention to it subsequently, the starting point was very risky decisions made with regard to lending in the United States, and then those debts being packaged up into these loan products that we sold to countries throughout the world. It really started on the West Coast in real estate, as we were writing mortgages for people that probably didn't have the ability to get a mortgage if we were actually paying attention to like their income, their ability to pay, et cetera, et cetera. And they were taking those junk mortgages, packaging them up into these larger products that we were selling to banks in Asia and banks in Europe, and misrepresenting. I mean, really fundamentally misrepresenting the degree of risk associated with those loans. So the starting point for the global financial crisis was bad decisions about lending, a nation that's fundamentally in debt, very high degree of debt, and then misrepresentation with regard to the risk associated with the debt as we were selling those loans to companies and financial institutions around the world. So a couple quotes just to give you a sense of this kind of combination of domestic economic decision making and then how it affects us all through interdependence. The first quote is from John Husted, who was a representative in the Ohio House of Representatives, now the Secretary of State for Ohio. But he lays out just kind of the issue in terms of our economic decision making in the United States. He says, we as a nation have $9.5 trillion in debt. This is $31,500 per consumer, and we have a consumer debt that is $8,300 per capita. That's crippling our economy as a result. We've witnessed irresponsible lending as a major factor in slowing our economy. It's not just consumers, but it's very large banks and firms on Wall Street. So he was diagnosing the problem in terms of debt, in terms of lending decisions that were made. Economist Paul Krugman, who is a big critic of the way in which the financial crisis, the series of steps that led us up to the financial crisis, said in a recent article, what we now know and should have been obvious even at the time was that the surface stability of the U.S. economy rested on an unsustainable rise in debt. In retrospect, the complacency of both policymakers and investors in the face of the trend visible in this chart, is referring to a chart showing the degree of consumer debt in the United States, is remarkable. Why weren't alarm bells ringing? Okay. The reason I bring all this up is to make a broader point about economic interdependence and economic globalization. Um, that is, and this is unavoidable, right? This is just the nature of the beast. Global economic interdependence greatly increases every country, and by extension, every individual's exposure to risk. So if the United States is making risky economic decisions and bad economic decisions with regard to lending and domestic economic policy, or individual lenders are making bad decisions and then trying to market loans and uh, financial products abroad that are fundamentally flawed in the decisions that led to them, then every country in the world is going to be exposed to that risk. And if enough bad decisions accumulate, it can have global repercussions, which is what we saw in 2008, 2009. Lots and lots of bad decisions by consumers, by lenders, by government entities that were supposed to be providing oversight, which, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, would have been a localized concern, not the case anymore. This degree to which the global economy has become integrated means that everybody is going to feel the effects from everybody else's screw ups. So we get the good, but we also get the bad. Okay. And that's an important point to keep in mind. So we'll wrap up there. There is one more Bretton Woods organization that we're going to talk about a little bit more next time, which is the World Bank. And we talk about that in the context of poverty and economic development, which is the topic for next time. I'm going to have you read in the Lamy textbook, chapter 9, which is about poverty and economic development. And as you do so, think about, what does global poverty mean to you? What are the secondary effects that arise out of global poverty? So what happens when a country or a region is chronically underdeveloped? They just don't have an engine for economic growth, and wealth and prosperity don't happen there. And I'm also going to ask you to think about the global gap between rich and poor states. The remarkable thing about this post-war economic boom, right, is that there is more volume of economic interaction and there is more wealth and prosperity in the world. But the gap between the very, very wealthy and the very poor is growing. It's not getting smaller. We're not seeing convergence between the rich and the poor. We're seeing a larger gap. So I want you to think about, what is causing that? What is causing this global gap between the rich and poor states, and why is it growing even as the global economy as a whole, by and large, has done pretty remarkably over the last 40 or 50 years. So we'll wrap up there and talk about those issues next time. Thanks.